Throwback Thursday. I've been mentioning about different TV programs. I'm going to mention about films in the future, artists, fashion designers, and books. But I've been doing a series about music albums. And so for the first 5 albums I've mentioned is number 1 was Michael Jackson's Thriller. Number 2 was Marvin Gaye's Here My Dear. Number 3 was Forever Changes by Love. Number 4 was Inner Visions by Stevie Wonder. And number 5 was Debut by Bjork. So the person who probably predecessed Bjork was a lady called Kate Bush. And my favourite album of hers is this album. It's called Never Forever. As you can imagine, all these wonderful things coming out of her skirt. It's a very quirky album. I mean, look at the inlay. I mean, this is kind of just how, you know, this idea of this kind of quirkiness and how eccentric she was. And this was released in 1980, so I was born in 81, but I've always had this album since very, very young. I think I got it when I used to go to boot sales, second garage sales, and buy stuff, and I think I got this when I was about 3 or 4. I bought records, but again, I love the album cover. It's kind of was a theme of mine when I was a kid. But most people know Kate Bush for her favourite songs as Wuthering Heights, and then probably the Hounds of Love album people love with Running Up That Hill, which is now become a massive hit due to the Stranger Things phenomenon. However, Never Forever has a diverse range of music, very like, I'd probably describe Hunky Dory by Bowie is kind of very similar to it, but I think where Kate Bush goes more into this kind of weird, sort of a little bit eclectic, quirky ideas of it, which is very interesting, and she inspires so many female performers such as Bjork, Tori Amos, Fiona Apple, and probably actually Billie Eilish in the later years. Probably she doesn't mention that as an influence, but it does work. So why do I like this album? Well, it's got a couple of tracks which I love. Actually, I love the whole album anyway. But first track is Babooshka, a track where she talks about this idea of trying to testing her husband, this character, and that she tries to pretend she's another woman. And this idea of this music has got this kind of very Russian-esque feel, and the actual word babushka, if you want to research it, is usually a woman who is not a married woman, so it's kind of an unusual way she's talking about this. But then she uses these ideas of the percussion. I think it's weird. She uses like glass smashes and these really unusual sort of percussion and production. And what I love about it is always got this kind of very weirdish theme. It kind of makes you unsettled, and it's got these kind of weird sounds and atmospheric. I suppose Babooshka would be kind of like the sequel to Wuthering Heights. I actually prefer Babooshka as the song. Wuthering Heights is a great track, don't get me wrong, but Babooshka to me is more, I find is a lot more poignant, and I think it's a lot more catchy and less, I think shrilly. I find Wuthering Heights was a bit shrilly, whereas Babooshka's a bit more interesting, and it's got that chorus which is a bit more rocky, which I really like. Then she's got these other tracks, Delius and Blow Away, which again, these are kind of idea of, again, these themes were quite interesting. Like Delius is like a poem, and then she's got Blown Away, which is for a character where she's actually talking about where she visits heaven and she sees all these artists who have died, and Bill must have been someone who was a musician she worked with. I'm not too sure if it was Bill Wyman, could be someone like that, I'm not too sure. But then she talks about, in the chorus, she talks about all the people who've died, like Buddy Holly, Sandy Denny, Sid Vicious, and all these other people who then this musician meets. Then the next track is All We Ever Look For, which is about the idea of how we in our lives look for our inspiration, and what do we look to, and what similarities we look for, and all we ever look for is talking about this genetics and our family and our conditioning. And I think it's a really interesting song talking about this. Next song is Egypt, where she's talking about this going down the Egyptian Nile, doing that, working with that, and kind of this very quaint little song. Again, these kind of like tone poems, which kind of remind me a lot of Forever Changes by Love. I do apologise, there's dogs barking outside. It's because I live in a very rural part of Spain, so do apologise for that. I hope you can hear me above it. Next track is The Wedding List. This is about a person who wants to get married, and the groom gets shot, and the actual woman is actually then seeks revenge to find out who shot the groom. and this is what it's kind of, it's actually like a rock song, it's like punk rock, and I think that's kind of where Kate Bush always had. She was like kind of experimental, quirky, but then she would go into this kind of punk rock sort of ideals. Violin, again, got very much, again, that punky feel, again in the middle. Infant Kiss is obviously about a child, a baby. And then she does Army Dreamers, which is about the idea of people going out to war and about how they lose their lives and about how they obviously wanted to be things more than just being a soldier. And that kind of track was interesting at the time because in 1980 people were going to Falklands. So again, very reflective of the time. Breathing is then about the idea of someone surviving a nuclear explosion. So the idea of actually can they breathe in afterwards and so forth. So actually there's a lot of politics in this album, but it doesn't seem like that. They seems more like these quirky little ideas, which as an album I don't think it did as well as The Kick Inside, because I don't think it was actually so commercial or poignant as much people thought, but actually as an album, as a theme, it's got a lot of interesting themes about how Kate Bush felt at that time. I hope I didn't say Kate Moss, because that's a totally different person. But anyway, so with this album, why I like it, it's actually quite interesting because I was also, when I grew up, I loved poetry. So the idea of some of these were poems but had music to them. So I kind of always had that influence going on, and I think also because I listened to this first, it's a good album, but why I liked Bjork's debut more was because I think that album had more catchy songs, but I think both of them together are very so having Bjork's debut and then this afterwards would be the two put together really are very influential in how I looked at music and how to create with ideas of poems into songs with minimal ideas, but actually something which was poignant but also was quite musically interesting, but had enough to it that you could catch on to it. So yes, this is my favourite album by Kate Bush. Quite unusual because, like I said, most people like Kick Inside or the Hounds of Love, but I just find this album just has that something extra. There's more personal things on it which I really prefer. In fact, one of her later albums, which if you get to hear, is where it's got This Woman's Work on, which is a really great album. And I think sometimes Kate Bush doesn't always get the credit because some of the albums didn't do so well in later years, but even the album with Ariel has some really good songs on it as well, which was released many years later. But again, what I like about Kate Bush is this idea of how she comes up with the quirkiness, contemporary and like very unconventional, that somehow makes it into these songs which are very memorable. And I would recommend this for anybody to try and listen to and enjoy, and just you'll find some really inspirational ideas in it, and it's actually a really good listen to an album, and it's not something where you want to skip stuff. You can kind of laugh at the tweeness, and it's very British as well, which was quite unusual in 1980 because most American artists nobody was really doing this kind of unusual stuff. This was sort of things what people were done in the late 60s and 70s, which were very British and unusual, but they were done by more male artists. So Kate Bush really was a pioneer in this kind of quirkiness and ideal of interesting musicality.